wisdom and advice on all things coronavirus because unlike apparently, the CDC and who I apparently have all the answers. Just kidding, I definitely don't. But I'm going to take my best shot at answering questions that have been at the tops of people's brains. So tonight, here's what we're going to cover. As I said, we'll have time at the end, a half hour for questions. So first things first, what are some of the major things that are happening in the changing landscape since COVID hit and has extended into not just the impact on class of 2020, but now very clearly will be impacting the class of 2021? Two main things: test optional. So this was a lesser known phenomena in college admissions pre-COVID, and now it is something we're all hearing about. 3/5 of the four-year colleges and universities in the US are now test optional for fall of 2021. That's huge. Prior to this, it was just maybe in the couple hundreds, and now we're talking about 3/5 of the schools all across the country. So schools not requiring ACT or SAT for admissions. So that website that I put there, fairtest.org, this is a comprehensive, updated weekly website that will have a list of all the schools that have gone test optional. And I feel like the surge has slowed a little bit because there has recently been an ACT and an SAT that was able to be administered in at least 50% of the country. But through the summer and the spring, so many test administrations were canceled that schools, it felt like daily, were announcing test optional policies. Like I said, that flow has slowed a little bit. I expect if there's an uptick in case numbers again nationwide, more tests in the fall will be canceled. So we may see even more schools go test optional. Recently, the California State University system was ruled in a court case to no longer be allowed to consider submitted scores for this year as well. So there's a difference between being test optional and then not considering them, and we call that test blind. So California State University systems are no longer even able to look at scores. Right now, that's the only state university system that has issued a blanket, well, they didn't issue the statement, the order was court ordered, but that's a blanket thing applied to them. So schools could still consider submitted scores from a student if they had them, if they're test optional. Test blind would mean it doesn't matter if you've submitted a perfect 36, we're not looking at it. So that's the distinguishing difference there. And then how does this impact the admission processes? I have several slides on just test optional all on its own. One of the things that is happening recently is it's forcing schools in the admissions process to look at other variables weighing into their decision. So on one hand, I actually think this is a very positive thing because for my entire career, I feel that testing is very tilted to families who can afford test prep. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do test prep if you can afford it, but it means that a certain demographic is usually disadvantaged in the testing world. So looking at other variables is a great thing when you think about this, wave of test optional. I think that it has also relieved some anxiety in students who maybe aren't the world's greatest test takers, and maybe they only had one time to test last fall. Let's say they're a senior this year and they tested last fall or last winter, and those were kind of their like, give it my best shot scores without really doing a lot of prep type of test. And so now that they don't have to submit scores, I think there's some anxiety relieved. However, I think it has exacerbated anxiety from other students. I've had 2 students in my current client load who spent the summer doing what I've coined chasing scores or chasing testing, and they're they would basically get a test canceled and then turn around and try to schedule for the next one. And it just led to this very exhaustive cycle of continuous prep all summer long, but not sure if your work was going to pay off. So at this point, test optional will be something we'll talk much more extensively in a future slide, well, a couple slides. But I put the ACT and SAT established dates on here simply because I want to illustrate what a stark change this is in the world of college admissions. SAT has been used in college admissions for almost 100 years, which is crazy. And now the world of college admissions is being forced to look inward. And I think that's a positive in all of it. The next thing in the changing landscape are post-secondary plans. And I don't have a ton of data on this yet, merely because we're experiencing this in real time right now. In fact, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling had someone appointed to simply gather the data of enrollment information from the class of 2020 who would be enrolling, like moving into campus either a couple weeks ago or right now currently. In June, in a survey of the class of 2020, 1 in 6 students were saying that they were rethinking their enrollment plans, possibly taking gap years or deferring. So we'll see what that data actually looks like when we have it. But speculatively right now, it seems like there's definitely some enrollment concerns, not at our top tier, big hitter, marquee name schools. Those schools really didn't have to go too deep into their wait lists. There weren't a ton of students deferring, but certainly more in those middle range schools. I think there was more talk, but I'm speculating just based on the various professional newsletters and listservs that I subscribe to, but it'll be incredibly interesting to see what the data looks like when it's all compiled. Other changing landscape, as we have all seen, I feel like I speak for everyone on this call when I say we're all kind of on pins and needles or the edge of our seats to see how long the grand experiment of reopening will last. Maybe it'll be great, maybe it'll be regionally dependent. These schools that I listed just in the last week have made the news for cases and different policies around how they're quarantining or handling student situations. So I imagine the impact on the class of 2021 will, many of those students, especially if the pandemic is not under control come spring, many of those seniors will be looking at how colleges and universities handled their reopening now, and possibly making some decisions based on what's come from just the news here in the last month. We'll see what happens. Like I said, very speculative, but I'll be very interested to see what the data shows. So going forward, everything I am about to say falls under these categories, which all essentially mean the same thing. I am not filled with infinite amounts of, foresight or wisdom over here. I just have 13 years of experience, and I read a lot. I subscribe to a lot of the professional, like I said, listservs and newsletters, and I'm doing my best to read the tea leaves and give some reassurances in some areas, and certainly to speculate where I think there could be issues in other areas. So I want this to be my massive disclaimer that a lot of this will be conjecture, and I'll be giving advice based on what I am advising my students to do, and you can take that advice for what it's worth to you. All right, so COVID and admissions. What's coming for our class of 2021? As I said previously, without the use of test scores, it's almost a guarantee there's going to be much more emphasis on grades and coursework. Grades and coursework were already more important in admissions than test scores. Test scores were a close third, but the grades a student has in the courses that they've taken and challenging themselves appropriately in those courses will now be front and center. Other areas that will move up in importance are going to be the qualitative informational pieces about a student. So essays and letters of recommendation. I cannot stress enough how much more important an essay will be now, because one fewer, like if the testing equals, 3 data points, let's say, the essay has to slide into that place. And then qualities and character. Colleges are going to be looking at those essays and the letters of recommendation and a student's activity list, which is part of their college application, to really get a sense of the student's character and what qualities comprise them and what kind of person they would be admitting to their campus. Any additional qualitative materials that students can submit. So oftentimes colleges will allow, not every school, but some schools will allow for optional submission of materials, perhaps like supplemental, like a writing portfolio or a piece of music or a piece of instrumental, vocal, or even performance art in terms of theater. Sometimes there's options for an art portfolio. Anytime a student can submit something more now, they absolutely should. That does not mean for your student to email their admissions officer and submit unsolicited materials. No. But if their application allows for optional materials, sometimes that's a resume, they should do it if those materials will highlight a different aspect of that student or add even more dimension and depth to your student. So the question of what to submit, if a student's resume is just a word for word copy of what they've put on their activity list, it's certainly not worth submitting. And I have some students where, they're 17, they're 18, their resume is not some 3-page, dossier. It's simply a page of things they've done in high school, and that's perfectly fine to just do the activity list. But if you have a student who has many worthwhile activities or accomplishments that can't be reflected elsewhere, they should upload that resume. That's the one I see the most often. That's why I spent a lot of time on the resume. And then, as I said, the optional materials, what best represents them. So even if they're not auditioning to be a theater major, but their school allows for the submission of an art portfolio in some way, if the student is strong in that area or it's some other dimension that's important to them, they should do it. But again, it needs to be important to them. Don't do it just to do it. I could say I'm a performing arts person, but I've been in one play my entire life. No. Only if it's something that is part of who they are. So this quote down here is just something that I placed here to highlight the importance of the qualities or the attributes. So school is really finding it more important to look at the character attributes. And this was from February of 2020. So this was pre-COVID, and it was already something schools were looking much more closely at. All right, COVID and admissions. I know I said I have a whole couple slides on testing, and I do, but testing has been the question at the top of everyone's brain lately, so that's why it's gonna make a couple appearances. So testing might matter. So remember earlier when I said test optional, yay! There's an asterisk next to test optional. And some schools may still require testing, possibly for admissions. That's why checking the college website and that fairtest.org website before you make a decision about whether to submit test scores or not is important. But also, let's say a school is not requiring test scores for admission, they may require them for scholarships or special programs. So special programs would be like an honors program or some kind of integrated pathway program. Nursing and engineering, commonly I've found, even if a school is test optional, nursing and engineering majors still have to submit test scores. Bowling Green State University for admission still has not rolled back their to test optional. So now I should caveat, that was as of 2 days ago when I put that in there. For all I know, they have since then, because that's how quickly the information is changing. And that's where I go back to always double check a school's website and fairtest.org, cross-reference them both, just double checking if you're on the fence about whether or not you or your student should submit scores. So keep in mind, testing might matter. The other piece now is speculation. What do I think will happen with admissions on a broader scale? I think it's reasonable to speculate that more students will stay in state, and generally, not always, but staying in state and attending a public university can oftentimes be less expensive. So I think we're going to see that shift. This happened quite notably in 2008. So that's the year, my very first day at Granville High School was August something, I don't know, August of 2008. And as we may recall in our not so recent, or actually very recent history, that was the Great Recession. And we saw a very similar trend right out the gate when I started there. Historically, Granville students had been almost like a 50-50 split of students staying in state and going out of state for college. And in the 5 years following the recession, we saw a shift just in our own small demographic of students staying in state and attending public schools. Things like the recession, things like COVID and a recession have a way of shaking us to our core, even those of us who are the most stable and financially secure. And the impact it has on young people and their psyche and their job prospects and all the what ifs that students are maybe, even if they're not verbalizing them, they're having to weigh those what ifs. What if someone in my family gets sick? What if I need to be able to get home quickly? So I think we're going to see that happen. Again, I have no data on this since we haven't been through the class of 2021 enrollment cycle yet to know for sure what will happen. The other thing I will talk about as well, not just on this slide, but in my advice for seniors slide, applying early is going to be more important than ever for the reason that it's not on this slide, but speculation, I'm sure you've heard, colleges, especially private colleges, are looking at possibly having to, I guess, reevaluate their financial situations, which could mean changing their delivery models, offering fewer majors, laying off staff. We saw even just in the news back in the summer, Ohio University, which is a larger public school, large public schools in Ohio have faced significant budget cuts at the state level. So money is going to be tight everywhere, and schools want to ensure their livelihood by knowing that students are going to attend. So that being said, applying early is a way to demonstrate that you're interested and you're probably going to attend. And I anticipate, again, I'm speculating, but I anticipate schools will be more desperate to ensure that they're going to enroll a class and will be more eager to accept students in those early rounds. So there's 3 types of early applications. There's rolling, which I'll mention more, early action, and early decision. So rolling application is kind of the idea of first come, first serve. So if you're waiting in line at a concert and you're first in line, you're going to get a better seat than the person last in line, back when there were concerts, as an aside. So I tell students, if you have a school that doesn't have set deadlines but admits on a rolling basis, you want to target the end, like the last week of September, first week of October, to get your materials in. That's going to ensure that you get first priority look and maybe even a slam dunk admit quickly out of the gate. Early action applications are non-binding. That means a student can apply early action, be admitted early, but isn't bound or obligated to attend the school. Many schools in Ohio have held with their early deadlines of being around November 1st. Ohio State moved November 1st back to November 15th. But early action generally is in November. Miami has early action. Off the top of my head, those were just a couple, but early action, I highly recommend. This is one of my favorites. And students could even apply before the early action deadline because, again, I'm speculating that schools might even start reviewing completed applications before the early action deadline passes. Again, that desperation, I suspect, will creep in. And then finally, early decision. This is the one that has lots of asterisks, stars, and underline and italics around it. Early decision is a binding agreement if they can only apply to one school early decision. And if a student applies to a school early decision, they're obligated to attend if they're admitted. Now, of course, there's extenuating circumstances that could dissolve that agreement, but I'm not going to go there, nor would I encourage anyone else to. So early decision, I speculate schools that offer early decision, students who applied early decision to a school that offered it, so not every school has this, historically have had an admissions advantage. And that advantage could range anywhere from a 5% higher admit rate all the way up to sometimes a 30 to 40% higher admit rate at schools that offer early decision. I suspect schools that offer this plan will admit a much larger percentage of their students under early decision for all the reasons I've already shared. So the caveat here, the asterisk, the stars, it is binding. So as a family, you do not have the option to weigh other financial aid offers against the financial aid offer of this institution. So that's always the catch. A student should only apply early decision if they cannot see themselves at any other school on their list. That's their top school, that's the winner, that's the #1 choice. A student should also not apply early decision if they need to be able to compare those financial aid awards. So that's my caveat on early decision. I'm happy to talk more in depth about it, but I wanted to make sure that was stated. And then financial aids. This is another big one. The FAFSA and the CSS profile, which is a much smaller percentage of schools that require it, but the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, opens October 1st. Absolutely get your FAFSA filed at every school to which your student is planning to apply as soon as you can. This year more than ever. Schools that schools start working on financial aid packages early. And the earlier you get your information in, the sooner they can put together an award. And even if they haven't sent the info to you or your student yet, that money has now been tied to your student. It's almost like the end of the rainbow, the pot of gold. If you're the last one to the pot, there might not be much, if anything, left. And with funding and budgets being cut, the earlier you can get that FAFSA filed, the better. Okay, and then this is just another story, another little link for you. I'm happy to send the presentation out. I put my email, as I shared at the top of the presentation, in the chat. So if you wanted this email, I am not stingy with this stuff. I will happily send it to you so you can click on all my active links and go to all the websites. But there was an NPR story just mid-August about how COVID has upended college admissions that was really good. So it was only like a 15-minute lesson. All right. COVID and testing. So top of everyone's brain usually is testing. And the way I broke these next few slides down, I broke it down by grade level. So I'm starting with seniors since they're, of course, the most impacted right now. And that's everything as it relates to COVID, what's happening right now, because tomorrow it could be different. But right now, it's our seniors who need the most TLC around figuring out this process. So for this year's seniors, as I said at the top, most colleges have implemented a test optional policy. Why? Because every kid has been impacted by testing, most likely throughout the last 6 months. I have one student of all of my students that I'm working with this year who had all of her testing done pre-COVID, one. So every other student had maybe a test, and then they got canceled and rolled into next tests and all that good business. So that's why so many schools have done it. It's the right thing to do. The policies per school, it's best to visit the individual institution website because, like I said previously, things are changing daily. Every time a test that is scheduled for ACT or SAT does or does not happen as planned, because a test happening is very dependent upon the region in which the test is taking place. So just this last Saturday, ACT was administered, as far as I know, everywhere around Central Ohio. But there are parts of the country where test centers were not allowed to open or could not open. Therefore, you want to check what the schools your students applying to, what their test policy is. And there's a couple caveats to that. Is their testing policy such that do they want the scores? Let's say your student has scores and they want to send them. Do they send them from ACT and SAT website, or do they just enter them in the self-reporting part on Common App? Every school, college, or university has indicated how they want to receive those scores, if they'll allow for them to be self-reported or if they want them sent from the testing website directly. And that's if your student chooses to send the scores. If your student is choosing not to report scores, everything I just said is not significant. But if you have a student that's planning to submit scores to all their schools or some of their schools, then it's really best to check every single institution's website to determine how they want to receive the scores. Do they need them officially, or can they just self-report them in Common App? Some schools will expressly say that they will not look at a score submitted officially. They only will look at the Common App, or vice versa. They won't look at the self-reported on the Common App. They'll only look at them officially. Yeah, I know. If you're thinking right now, oh my gosh, there's so much to track and keep track of, it is. And it's a process, and it definitely takes time. As I've said before, it's a fluid situation, so I can't underscore enough, always double checking each institution's website. So the $1 million question, do I send my scores or not? And if so, do I send them to every school or some of the schools? I'll use a student I'm working with right now as an example. Her score is solid. She only was able to test in the spring before everything shut down. She was able to take the ACT administered at her high school, and she scored a 27. So first time out the gate, 27. She spent all summer chasing testing, had a really difficult time, couldn't get scheduled anywhere. So for right now, the schools on her list, she's got a range of schools from selective for her GPA and test score, all the way down to, safety schools for her GPA and test score. For the safety schools and the target schools, so the ones where she's in the middle 50% of students typically admitted at that school, she is going to send her 27 because she will stand out with that score from the applicant pool. However, at the schools that are more at the top of her selectivity list, she is not going to send those scores. So that's part of the conversation and research that needs to happen. And then at the schools on her list, of the 8 schools on her list, 3 of them are more reach schools, so she is not self-reporting or sending official scores, but 5 of them she is sending scores to. 3 of them only will allow self-report. They do not require students to send them officially, and they say you don't even need to send these officially until if you plan to enroll. And then 2 of the schools won't look at the self-report. They only want them official. And then the next question, should I try to test again? So if you're a senior and you're wondering like, okay, I've missed my September opportunity because that just happened on Saturday for ACT, what should I do in the coming weeks and months. So there is an SAT coming up September 26th. That deadline has already passed, as well as the late deadline. Should you test again? It's really going to depend on what schools you have on your list and if there's any programs or scholarships that you have to have a test score for. So as I said in a previous slide, as it relates to admission, a school may be test optional for admission policy, but if there's a special program at the school, like an honors program or a research opportunity or some kind of scholars program where you're connected with students of similar interests around one academic discipline, you may need to have a test score for that. So knowing what schools are going to require scores and what they need the scores for should inform whether or not you test again. My personal opinion, I do not think any student should put themselves in a situation that they or their family is uncomfortable with, even if, especially if that student is high risk or someone in the family is high risk. Colleges are looking for reasons to admit a student and not to not admit a student. And if they're saying they're test optional, in my opinion, they should be putting their money where their mouth is and not be putting kids through this additional roller coaster that is this year. So that's my soapbox. But I think a student needs to just know what schools are on your list, what are their policies, what programs are you looking at, and do you need test scores for those? Otherwise, if you don't need them, don't chase them. Give yourself a break in what has already been an exhausting year and move forward.
Amber, we have two questions real quick. If we can. One, we're going to go back a little bit, and the individual is wondering if their child wants to apply early, or but they're waiting on the high school to send transcripts or letters of recommendation. Like, for instance, the rolling. How does that impact? Do you know what the process is at the school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things. Schools, I know just from my time at Granville, but now that I work with students all over Central Ohio at all different schools, right now I have students at 8 different public and 2 private high schools. Policies are different in every office and in every school, but I think I am safe to say a blanket statement. Most college or most high school college offices are not ready to send anything until the last week of September. And a lot of that has to do with behind the scenes integration data that has to happen, these crazy processes with the student information systems to run transcripts. It's a nightmare, having observed it for many years. So if the student is trying to get their application in, control what you can control, apply early with your materials, and then just make sure that you have crossed every T and dotted every I in getting all of your high school's required forms and paperwork in within the time frame that has been requested by the counseling office or the teachers. Get your materials in, communicate with the people who are pulling the levers that you don't have control over so that they're aware that you're working toward early deadlines. You're not going to annoy them, especially if you're, maybe you'll annoy them if you're like rude, but if you're kind and understanding that we're all in this together, we're having done the job, I can tell you, like, we get it. Everyone wants to be in early. We want to get stuff in early. Sometimes we just can't because we're waiting on other processes. But if a student handles their side of things, colleges generally are understanding about that, but they will not evaluate a student's application until all the other materials come in. But if you express to your high school counselor that it's a rolling deadline, that underscores and emphasizes to that counselor that they need to be on the ball and getting it done. And there's nothing wrong with following up and checking in as long as it's done, diplomatically.
And then the other question we had, I think you kind of covered, but I just to be sure, what is the difference between submitting test scores officially versus the Common App?
Yes, so Common App has a section called testing, and students can put in their scores. They're self-reporting. It's an honor system, basically. Like, here's what I got. Now, when I say honor system, if a student ultimately enrolls at Stanford and they reported that they got a perfect 36 across the board on all the sections of the ACT, and then they are expected to submit their official test score sent directly from ACT, from their ACT account, and it doesn't match, their self-reporting was invalid and they're not going to be able to keep their admitted spot. But official reporting means logging into your student's ACT or College Board, that's SAT, account, and then sending the scores directly from their accounts at those official testing agencies. Okay. Any others right around this topic while we're on the topic, Wendy?
One more is talking about the student character being a variable. I think you can see it in the chat. Is there value in getting outside letters of recommendation from perhaps a pastor or a coach or outside I think normally most people go to their teachers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, there is value in that this year. That's not something, a couple caveats on that. There is value, absolutely. Not every school allows for submission of outside letters of recommendation. In fact, on the Common Application, and I'm referring to that a lot simply because most schools accept the Common App. On the Common Application, within the school's landing page or their profile, if you scroll down, you can actually see how many, they call them other recommenders, they'll allow. Some schools allow 0. They don't want to see anything that's not a teacher or a counselor, whereas other schools may allow up to 2 or 3. So the caveats become, if your student's school or schools allow for other recommenders, do not oversaturate or bombard, especially if these other recommenders cannot offer insight on your student that hasn't already been, like if it's already been said by teachers or a counselor, it's just more work for the admissions person. You don't want that either. So make sure that it's a quality ask and someone who can speak to a new dimension of your student. All right, let's go forward. There we go. All right, so on these next slides, I'm going to cover these 3 bullet points as it relates to testing. So if you're on this call with your junior, my juniors, I am telling them right now, this is the mantra to keep in mind, this top bullet: prepare for testing this year the way you would have prepared in any other year. We have no guarantee that test optional policies will continue. I do know that a lot of schools are using this as an opportunity to pilot test optional, and I'm hopeful that it will stick, because I find it to be an incredibly stress-inducing and financial strain for a lot of families to take on, and a lot of students to take on. So it would be great if it lasted. I'm not terribly optimistic, but that would be my hope. In the state of Ohio, as of right now, the annual school-based ACT or SAT, whichever your student's public school chooses for their free state-sponsored test, is still going as scheduled, still going as planned. But if 2020 has taught us anything, don't make a plan and then also plan that the plan won't go according to plan. So bottom line, carry on as you would any other year. So that brings me to the answer to the question about when to test. So I've broken it down into 2 subject areas that you can use as a compass to help navigate. Subject, and then what level completed of that subject is going to put your student or you in the best position to earn the best score possible. And then what should your prep plan be, and when should you test? So for math, students who've completed Algebra 2 or higher could test now in the fall or winter for their first test if they've not tested at all yet. I'm basing it off of that, like that you haven't tested. And then their second round of testing could occur in the winter or spring. And then completing a practice test now, there's so many free practice tests out there, or you can purchase like an ACT or SAT prep book, and there's practice tests in there as well as samples of, the answer documents. And then with English, students tend to get their best reading and English scores if they at least have the first half of their English 11 or junior year English completed. Now, if your student is accelerated or advanced, it's when they would have had that level completed to get their best score in English. And then again, practice tests can start now, testing for the first time sometime in the winter, and then winter or spring for their second test. Sorry in advance if you hear my cat meowing in the background. I'm not gonna run and let him out, so he just might meow. Okay, so that's a way to just gauge where your student is at, plot it on a map, and figure out from this timeline when the best time to test will be. There will never be a perfect time, so let me just get that out of the way too. You're never gonna strike at exactly the right moment with math or English. That's why testing multiple times is important. And when I say multiple, I mean 2 or 3. I don't think you need to do overkill and go into like 5 or 6. And we don't even know with COVID if that'll be possible. But at least getting that first test under your belt. So here's what we have for our upcoming fall test dates. I'm gonna leave this screen here, and I am gonna go let out that cat that I mentioned, and I'll be right back. Okay, well, sorry about that unprofessional cat situation. All right, so we have fall test dates for our seniors and juniors and maybe 10th graders, depending on where they fell in that graph that I just showed. So we see what's coming up. We see that for the October tests, there's no late registration. So all of these October tests, ACT added extra ones this year, and they are not allowing late registration. So the deadline is the deadline. And then in December, we're kind of back to business as usual. There's not added test dates through the winter months at this point, all of which is subject to change. SAT has 2 remaining dates for September and October. And I highlighted this down here because if your students interested in the October 3rd test, the late registration deadline for both of these is today. Like by 11:59 p.m. is the deadline. So if they're planning to test, gotta register ASAP. And then we have the remaining deadlines for November and December. And this is a return to quote unquote normalcy in the testing world, is 1 test of ACT or SAT a month. The fall is very front loaded, made to accommodate seniors who have been, as I said previously, chasing testing, and juniors who maybe are already have Algebra 2 under their belts and feel like they want to get a test or 2 in here in the fall. Just because there's opportunities to test doesn't mean that your senior should try to get one of these October tests. If you'll note, from the 17th onward, they're all cutting it very close to any November 1st deadlines for those test scores to even be included in a November 1st application. So I've advised my seniors who were asking about October tests, if you have a November 1st deadline and you're trying to get these scores by then, that's not going to happen. If you test and you're able to get the scores for later deadlines and you like the scores, you can use them. But that's really down to the student at that point. And if, students are now, for the first time in 6 months, working harder than they've worked in quite a while, and adding testing in could also just be one more stressor in an otherwise very stressful year. As far as PSAT and pre-ACT, these are on as planned as of this minute. So again, that's the caveat. It's hard to know what will happen tomorrow, let alone next week with all of this. But as of right now, the second week in October is the primary test day for PSAT. The big shift this year, there's always been a Saturday date and an alternate date. And it's really your school. It's their choice which date they administer. So just pay attention to your school announcements for PSAT information. But there is a new test day, new this year, being administered in January. So for schools that just understandably couldn't get things off the ground, you pretty much have to order the test the minute you walk back into the building in August. So if that wasn't happening for a lot of schools, the January PSAT is a new addition. So just be sure that you know what's happening at your student's school with regard to these practice tests. Similarly, the pre-ACT, another practice test, this doesn't have a specific test day designated by ACT. Schools can choose to administer the pre-ACT anytime they want. So if your school administers the pre-ACT, you'll just want to find out when they're planning to do that. And then last thing on these practice types of tests, absolutely students in grades 10 and 11 should take the PSAT. It's really inexpensive practice with great individualized feedback on each section. And then similar with pre-ACT. All right, this is my last, second to last section, COVID and financial aid. So parents of seniors, this is a big one for you. I mentioned previously the FAFSA opens October 1st. Dovetailing off of my mantra of early is better, I'm saying the same for FAFSA for all of my students. Getting it in as soon as possible is critical. First one to the pot gets, you kind of get earmarked for a little more possibly if you qualify than maybe students toward the end of the race. And yes, if you're sitting here thinking there's no way we're going to qualify, I am encouraging every family to still submit. And this has kind of been my blanket advice always. I think it's important to submit the FAFSA for a few reasons. Financial situations can change on a dime, and you never know if you might need to fall back on the cushion of a low interest federal loan, which you cannot access if you have not filed the FAFSA. So even if you know you'll get absolutely no need-based aid from the government, you cannot access a low interest federal loan unless the FAFSA is on file. That being said, the only reason not to submit would be if you have no change anticipated in the future and you have a plan to cover every last penny of this year college-wise and, well, your student's freshman year, and you're not concerned whatsoever. So it really, that is more of a family or a personal decision, but my blanket advice is to submit. The other thing to keep in mind is the FAFSA is based off of prior taxes. So if a student is applying for fall of 2021, prior is, there's two priors there, so you subtract 2 and you get 2019. So the 2019 taxes are what will be pulled in to your FAFSA. And of course, those may no longer be an accurate financial reflection of your family situation. So the best thing you can do come October 1st is have all your materials ready. Get your W-2s, year-end financial statements for 2019, and then any updated financial info if there have been changes to your income or employment status. You will need every document down to the letter that will need to be submitted in the event that you may need to appeal. So if you have been impacted in some way financially since 2019, and this, it doesn't even have to be COVID, if there's been an unexpected, loss of income, any family who's been through the ringer with this in the past has had to do the same thing. You have to usually appeal your financial aid information because what you're submitting isn't a good reflection. So every documentation, you'll need to have on hand. My other piece of advice is early is better. I've said this many times now, and the same is true for financial aid. So your student, your senior, you know what schools they're submitting the FAFSA to. When you submit that FAFSA to school XYZ, my advice would be within the next week to contact the financial aid office at every school to which your child is applying to let them know your updated financial circumstance. Now, this may not apply to you whatsoever, in which case you've made it through 2020 in this aspect relatively unscathed, which is great. But if this does apply to you, please heed this advice, because when you come knocking in May saying, well, actually, that statement I submitted back, the FAFSA I submitted in October isn't accurate, and now it's May, money has already been earmarked, designated to go to other students, and allocated elsewhere. And it's better to be on the front end. Even if they can't help you right then, they can at least make a note or reassess the situation. So these are people who work in the financial aid offices. This is what they do full time, is counsel families on financial aid. So it's okay to call. Just a funny little cartoon for your amusement. Some speculation now. Budget cuts. I've mentioned this previously across this state, and I imagine many other states have been impacted as well. Higher education institutions do get a cut of money from the state government, and there have been significant cuts there. So smaller financial aid packages, if you are a family that has need and would have in previous years maybe gotten significant need-based financial aid, those packages may be smaller. Schools may not be able to give as much need-based aid. There may be more gaps in the funding. The gap is the difference between what a school can provide in financial aid and what a family can afford to pay. So that's why I go back to having that FAFSA on file, because a low interest federal loan is only available to families if they filed the FAFSA. Schools may close, merge, or change their delivery model. Schools that can be nimble and adjust quickly are going to come out of this in better shape than schools that are poorly managed or have been operating in the red. There have been several different publications that have come out with evaluations of schools' financial situations. The one I go by quite a bit is Forbes. They publish one every year in November, which is not helpful right now because the one they published last November may in fact no longer be accurate, but every year they publish a financial report card in November on the top, and I say top, but I mean like 1,500 different universities and colleges in the country. So if you're concerned and your student has applied to their schools or is applying November and December, definitely look for that Forbes grade card, because you'll be able to check and see what grade Forbes has given their school. It looks at their endowment, if they've operated in the red, what they spend per pupil. It's a pretty comprehensive report. And then this last point, and we're so far off from May and June that it just feels like we're never going to get there. But for parents of seniors, this happened to one of my students, one of my graduating seniors in the class of 2020 in June. It may be possible to get more aid in May and June. Now, don't misunderstand. Still apply early, still submit your FAFSA early, still go through the appeal process early, do all the earlies. But don't commit to a school necessarily unless your student hands down is like, yes, I'm going there. But I had a student in June this year who both of her schools had extended their decision dates, their reply by dates, to the end of June. And she was really back and forth. She couldn't go for her admitted student days or any of those things. She couldn't go for her visits. And she was back and forth with them, and a school, in an effort to ensure that they could get her to enroll, they, at the last minute, threw like $8,000 more onto her financial aid package. Her dad was just going back and forth with the financial aid office and the admissions office. He wasn't trying to like bargain. He just was like, she's really torn. This is her top choice, is the most expensive. And they were able to put more money on top of it to incentivize. So just keep that in your back pocket. Kind of interesting. All right, last one. This is my last one. COVID and campus visits. This happened to juniors last year, and they are now seniors. Many juniors do their campus visits in the spring of their junior year and in the summer following their junior year. And of course, many schools were not welcoming people to campus. Their admissions offices were closed down. Their visitor centers were closed. So now these same dear darling juniors are seniors trying to apply to schools relatively sight unseen. So here are my tips. And our very eager current juniors and current sophomores can follow these tips as well. In fact, I would encourage all juniors right now to start researching, because we have no idea if they'll be able to get onto campus this year either. So virtual visits and virtual info sessions. COVID has required schools to quickly become tech savvy, and so many schools now have virtual admissions info sessions on their visit website. So that's what I have there in the first bullet. And then they have, more schools have virtual tours through a company called UVisit. They're quite nice 3D virtual tours. Again, nothing beats the actual experience of being there, but it's something. And then more and more schools, I've watched this slowly like unfurl throughout the spring and summer. Schools have added bonus virtual sessions. There are these pre-recorded, maybe a departmental chair of the English department gives a 40-minute presentation on the English department. There's student panels. Then you can also do live Zoom meetings with your admissions counselor. So schools that haven't offered stuff like this in the past are now offering them virtually because they can, and it can be pre-recorded. So attend any of these at schools of interest that your student has, as many as possible, because the other piece is this is tracked by colleges. So some schools will actually use information on, oh, I see that Amber has applied here, and I see she also attended our virtual admission session. Oh, and she went to the academic department meeting for, biochemistry and attended the student panel thing. So they're able to actually see what ones I've registered for, and all that data is housed at that university. And again, in times of financial strain, schools want to offer admission to students that they feel more confident are going to actually enroll. They want the tuition dollars. Other things that you and your student could do, you could walk the campus. I've had families who still are treating this whole process like it's a campus visit. They just don't get to go to the info session, but since the weather currently is relatively nice, families can go and print a map in advance and walk campus. They might not be able to go into buildings or classrooms or residence halls, but they can at least get on the campus and feel what it's like. Virtual college fairs, there are several coming up. These are the two that I've been to lots of virtual fairs, and I feel like the NACAC and StriveScan do the best job of offering, they're free, but they offer a lot of quote unquote bang for your buck. You can go to different info sessions while also dropping into different admissions booths. All of that information is tracked as well. If I go to a college fair and I check in at 6 different booths virtually, that school now has me in their system. So it's annoying to suggest that you have to still play this game in a pandemic and demonstrate interest to these schools, but it's something that can also help with the student, on the flip side, learning more about the school too. So I guess it's okay. And then other things, there's a website called Campus Reel that actually has students speaking about their school, and they're very real on the reel. And they're talking about everything from the social scene, i.e. party scene, to the academic scene, to the athletic scene. So it is very real. It's appropriate, but it's just a very like authentic expression of a student talking about their school. I don't get the sense when I watch those videos that they're hired tour guides by the school. Other ways to research, almost every school has a YouTube channel. They all have the social medias, all the socials. They have their website. Depending on what school you or your student attend, Naviance, Score, and College Board are all college search tools that can be used for research. These were all in existence pre-COVID. The things I mentioned before are a little bit more COVID specific. And then this last slide is just demonstrate that interest, people. We got to get that interest out there because schools are stumbling around blindly trying to find students. And in the past, coming to campus was like a slam dunk way to know that you were interested. Now you've got to work a little harder to demonstrate your interest, but a school has to work harder to find you. So make it a little easier for them and follow them on the socials and go to the virtual info sessions. All right, my last couple slides are just a couple pro tips. A lot of it I'll be reiterating things I've already said. Dear seniors, early is key. Applications for everything, all the things early. And then even be early for your deadlines if you can. So I say if you can because I realize they're multidimensional, dynamic human beings that have more going on than just applying for college. But be early if you can. Subscribe. This is how we demonstrate interest. The listservs, the socials, the newsletters, the emails. But it's also extra important this year because if a school makes a change to their test policy, let's say, or maybe a fall visit day has to be canceled or moved, you want to know about that before you show up on campus. Families, if you think you'll qualify for need-based aid, and your child could be merit eligible too, meaning they have usually a 3.0 to a 3.5 GPA or higher, and they get scholarships based on their GPA. Be sure to apply to schools that are generous with both merit aid and need-based aid. And my favorite website to find that information is collegedata.com. It's free. You have to make an account, annoying, and we live in the world of making accounts now. But search for the school that your student's interested in, click Money Matters, that tab, and if you scroll down, you'll actually be able to see what percentage of students get need-based aid and what's the average amount of need-based aid and what percent of students get merit aid and what's the average amount of merit aid. And what you'll find is some schools you'll see, oh, they get a lot of need-based aid but no merit aid, or they get very little need-based aid and some merit aid. I like schools for families who have need and a child who's maybe relatively or very high achieving. I love those schools that are both. Case Western, I'm not trying to plug them, but that's one that I love because they offer both. So collegedata.com, Money Matters, the real deal. Seniors, still, balanced lists, still critical. This is not the year to just say, oh, it's test optional, I'll just throw my hat in the ring and see what happens. You could, but you also might find very quickly that there's lots of extra essays or extra supplements that you have to write if you're applying to schools that are way, way far on the reach continuum. And here's the thing, schools are still going to be looking at the GPA and the curriculum. So if you don't have the strong curriculum and you're thinking this will be my year to apply to Harvard, and you haven't maybe challenged yourself, or maybe you don't have a really strong GPA, this isn't necessarily the year to do that either. Additionally, transparency between parents and students. Parents and students need to have conversations around, well, just because that school is not requiring test scores or just because this is a crazy year doesn't mean you can apply to schools in, I don't know, like Wyoming, and maybe you have no desire to let your student go to Wyoming. So have those conversations on the front end. Two things on essays, seniors. The why us essays are more important than ever before. Not every school has this extra essay. Few schools have an extra essay, but for those that do, and if they ask some version of why do you want to come here? What about this school is appealing to you? What do you hope to achieve at our institution? These are all thinly veiled ways of asking why us. This essay is more important than ever before. This is the time to show why that school made your list. And it's about doing research in all the ways I just mentioned that maybe aren't true campus visits, but are still ways to research a school. It's about doing research and clicking at least 3 to 5 clicks deeper than the landing page of the school's website. Don't go to the school's website, see that, oh, there's a 32-acre arboretum on our campus, and then that somehow makes it into your essay. If that's on the landing page, it shouldn't be in your essay. It needs to be very specific and detailed about why that school is the perfect fit for you and why you're a good fit for them. So classes that you're interested in taking, professors that you want to work alongside or work with. Maybe there's a specific program of interest to you. So it needs to be 3 to 5 clicks deeper than the landing page. Third main bullet point, the COVID essay. This is new this year. Within Common App, they have added a special essay. It's optional, so it's not required. And it asks, it gives this caveat statement of some people have been significantly impacted by COVID. Every student I've worked with who's a senior right now has asked me if they should write that essay. I only have one student who, and it's not my place to judge, but her family, like dad lost a job, her brother got COVID, like there was a significant impact in her life as a result of the pandemic. Students who maybe had to get creative about ways to stay engaged over the summer or had a school trip canceled, like those aren't, yes, you've been impacted, but those would fall maybe more under like an inconvenience. So I've really tried to encourage students, like, were you impacted or inconvenienced? And the essay should not be, what did I do on my COVID staycation? It really should be like an impact statement. So most students that I'm working with are leaving that one blank. So just because it's there doesn't mean your student should answer it. However, if they have a compelling, and compelling is the wrong word, if they have a situation that really warrants explanation, they should. And situations could be like really struggling with the move to online learning in the spring, and maybe their grades tanked and that shows on their transcript. That's absolutely appropriate. Or like I used with the student that I'm working with, that example is appropriate as well. And then I said this already, contact financial aid offices. Don't be shy about it. Don't be surprised. The earlier, the better. And then this is something I've not mentioned, but COVID burnout, I anticipate, I'm speculating, that will be a very real thing for financial aid officers. They're probably going to be working with a huge volume of families who have been impacted. So if you can kind of get in there sooner rather than later, you might get a little more, I guess, positive energy. All right, juniors and eager sophomores, your pro tips. I said before, proceed as though everything is going to go back to the way it was before. Test as soon as it makes sense for you and your student. The lesson we learned from 2020 is early is better. No junioritis, my dear juniors. It's been hard because you've been off of traditional school for 6 months leading up to this current month, but you've got to spring back. No matter what happens this year, colleges will not be as flexible. This is my speculation, but I highly doubt it. Like, we all know what we're dealing with now. Schools aren't going to be as flexible for class of 2022 as they were and will be for class of 2021. So we can hope, but don't plan for it. And then continuing to pursue personal best academically. We have got to rise above the circumstances as best as possible. That I'm not trying to say that to negate major mental health or family situations, of course, but doing what you can within the world in which you exist to achieve at your highest level possible. And then, of course, beginning to research the virtual tools that I just went through, using those to do research. And then activities. Let's just pretend that testing still isn't a thing by the time juniors and even maybe sophomores apply. So make some lemonade out of this situation. Use your platform, who you are in your school, in your community, in your family. Look for ways that you can make a positive impact in some way. Think outside the box. Maybe your student is innovative and they can figure out how to have a safe homecoming dance. You know, that was such a big deal in the spring when proms got canceled. Just throwing ideas out there. But your student could pursue opportunities and out of the box thinking with gusto. So this is the year to try something new. This is the year to go out on a limb or take a risk, because trying to make the world better when the world has somewhat broken would be like, it's better than nothing. So that's my encouragement for the younger high schoolers. And a bonus slide, it's my last one. COVID and anxiety, this is very real. I wouldn't be a true counselor if I didn't acknowledge that anxiety is like, we're fraught with it, even, you know, even counselors and those who are even the most nimble or adept. This is, of course, completely bizarre and crazy what we're living through. So the best thing I can suggest for students is to try to adopt a flexible mindset around college. You will go to college, you will get there somehow, it will happen somehow. It may not look like or feel like how we want it to, with all the milestones and markers and traditional plans, but we'll get there. And then resources, like I said, I'm happy to send the PowerPoint if you just shoot me an email. Our website, estrelaconsulting.com, we've been compiling since the pandemic started, since March, and now we have this like 3 pages worth of scrolling. College planning resources grouped by campus visits, grouped by financial aid, grouped by testing. It's in our banner page right at the top. You can click on it. And then I listened to a webinar by a guy named Jeff Salingo, and our founder, Christina, she posted it to the Estrella Facebook page, and it was an hour-long webinar. It was fabulous. It was with an admission counselor at the University of Chicago, and it was just phenomenal. So highly recommend that as well. And then my email is down here at the bottom.